Hi, I'm Tom Arnold. You're at Arnold's farm, where I never has heard a discouraging word and the sky's not cloudy all day. We are a livestock farm. We raise chickens, which you see in front of us. We raise them on pasture. We have a beef operation, cow-calf. We raise out the calves for sale, and a hog operation. We have 80 sows farrowing year-round. So everything is marketed directly to consumers through an online shopping cart and store, some retail locations, and a few restaurants. So what I'm going to show you today is our chicken operation and how I feel it has improved soil where they are allowed to be, or where we're raising them. Now, I wouldn't expect anyone to say that this is how we're going to run a 1,000-acre operation. We're going to run chickens all over them to improve the soil. I don't think you're going to have the will and the fortitude to want to actually do that. But what I have seen over the years is a definite improvement in quality. We have on our hill ground shallow soils, clay, I think they would be referred to as timber soils. In some areas there may only be 6 inches of topsoil, and then you're right down to kind of a gravelly bedrock and then solid bedrock. Other areas are a little deeper but still very clay. So we have a very tight soil that dries out quickly. Our rotation on most of these hills is 5 to 6 years in hay with a nurse crop of oats to get started, and then maybe a year of corn, 2 at the very most, and then right back into some sort of a forage. And we find that the forages do well, particularly alfalfa, because we have that taproot that goes down and can bring up moisture and nutrients from down deep, and also helps keep that soil somewhat broken up. If we try to go corn on corn for any sort of length of time, yields keep going downhill. When I first came here, yields on corn were maybe a little over 100 bushel an acre. Recently, with the very sparse rotation of corn, we're seeing closer to 150 to 160. Now, not because we're dragging chickens all over, but I think a lot of that is to do with using the forages and not disturbing the soil for that number of years, and then only doing tillage 1 year. We don't have the equipment for no-till, so we still do a relative amount of tillage. So what I would like to show this morning is moving the pens. I'll explain the cycle from when we actually get them as chicks to when we're ready to take them to a processor. And this is only an 8-week period, so this is a quick turnaround. One of the reasons I'm doing this was when I first come back to farm 30 years ago, we were a dairy at that time, a small dairy, and this land was suited very well to that. It's suited to livestock and the feed that would need to be raised for dairy, a lot being forage and pasture. So I did not have the equipment to farm all over the county corn and soybeans, and I chose not to do that. We have 480 acres that is owned, and we rented another, at that time, about 100 acres. I felt if I couldn't make a living on that amount of acreage, I wasn't doing it right. So we did some research. We felt this direct marketing to consumers was the way to go for our acreage, and after throwing a bunch of darts at the wall and finding which ones stuck, chickens was one of them. We always had beef. There's always been cattle on this farm. My dad always had hogs, so there's always been hogs. Chickens off and on. My mother had a laying flock of 100 hens. I grew up with that. My first 4-H project was chickens, and I got grand champion rooster at the county fair. So I have a little bit of background there, and I thought, well, we'll get back into it. This particular setup has been championed by a man named Joel Salatin in Virginia. I'd actually toured his farm on a field day he had. We had started making these pens and doing this before then, but the trip there helped me fine-tune a lot of things, and we've been doing this for going on 25 years. So even though it's labor-intensive, the number of birds that we raise and the price that we get for them well pays for our time and our effort. These pens have actually, the first pens I built, so they're well depreciated. I spent $200 a pen, and over 20 years, $10 a year isn't bad for housing for chickens. Plus we have no manure. We have no buildings to clean out. The manure is directly on the ground, and we'll show you how that works. All right, so the job is, and the idea is to move each pen 1 pen length so that we've got fresh grass for the birds. We do this every day, sometimes twice a day, depending on how large the birds are and how much they've cleaned up. Right now, we had just a week ago cut this field as hay. It was getting too tall for this type of an operation, and we had to kind of wait for the weather and all. So as you can see, we've got regrowth. This is an alfalfa grass mix. It's a little heavier on the grass now. The alfalfa has started to die out, plus the pressure of the chickens, and we run turkeys out here too. Sometimes if we're not moving soon enough or quick enough, or it gets very wet, the animals actually decimate the area. So we had a lot of trouble at certain periods the last 2 years with basically an area just turning all to mud because we could not move them quick enough. So what we're going to do is we're going to move the pen. I could not do that without this handy dolly. So this was one of the things when I went to visit Joel Salatin, I was very interested in how they designed this dolly. So these pens weigh probably, I want to say 150 pounds, probably not much more than that. And what we're going to do, I'll wait for my videographer to catch up with me here. People are wondering, well, how does this work? On the back of the pen we have a loop. Throw the dolly underneath. That gets that back end up a couple inches off the ground. So now we're going to move around to the front. We're going to bring that pen ahead. By raising that lid, it allows me to walk in the very back of the pen to make sure that we're not, we don't have any laggers back there, and everybody's moving ahead, and we're not going to run over anybody. It's just a matter of tugging it forward. Everybody's ready to move, so they're coming along. And you can see them working on those green shoots right away. So we try to make sure that we're 1 pen length ahead. The idea there is to cover the whole ground with their litter. So now let's check in the back. We're a pen length ahead. We're going to pull this out. Pen is moved. Next, we're going to start our water. So, because we're moving these pens all the time, we can't have a stationary water system. We have to need something that moves with the pen. This is one of the beauties about this whole design. So we have a 5-gallon pail that's connected to a drinker that automatically shuts off when it fills up. It's a spring-loaded drinker, this red drinker down here. So we're going to turn on our water. Our water comes from a reservoir up on the hill in the high point of the land. You can see it way up there in the corner. I'll show you the piping system. We have a black pipe that comes down with hydrants on it. A garden hose attached to the hydrant that allows us some flexibility to move from pen to fill it up. So oftentimes when I'm working, I can fill the feeders with feed while this is filling with water. Then I move to the next pen, move it, and do the same thing over again. Okay, I'd like to show you the water system. So this is our black line that comes down from the reservoir up in the high end of the field. It has these hydrants in it that are a quick disconnect. So the garden hose has a fitting like that on it. You just press it in, it locks in with a snap. And then we have these hydrants throughout the line. So eventually, this is as far as we've gotten this year with these pens. It's the first batch, but we will continue down the field with the second batch. and we'll keep extending this water line, so eventually the water line will be all the way down the field. We don't run it out ahead of time because if we're cutting the field, we'd have to pick it up anyway. So we want to not have to deal with it any more than necessary. We're going to start out by taking some feed to the pens. We raise our own corn. We use a non-GMO variety. That's what we've always used. I just feel that's what I want to use. This is a mix of soybean meal, which we purchase, and minerals, and the ground corn from our land. We grind this here. We grind probably, at this point, these chickens are almost ready to process. They're 7.5 going on 8 weeks, and they're going to go through a ton of feed a week. There's 800 birds out here. All right, so ideally we want a feeder that moves with the pen, so we're not picking up feeders and moving them to picking them up, having to put them back in. So I designed a PVC pipe type feeder where we cut a 10-foot length in half, put some ends on it, and then suspend it by wires on the pen. So this is enough to get the number of birds we have in here fed for part of the day. So this will get us through into the afternoon. Late afternoon when we're feeding again, we fill them up again, and by the morning they're mostly emptied again. Also the water, in the evening we probably don't fill those tanks up quite as much, simply because in the morning we don't want to be having to lift and move 40 pounds of water. I don't worry about being too careful if something spills. These birds are going to clean up every little morsel that's out here. So there we've done one pen. So we repeat that for the other 7 that I have here. We have 8 pens, roughly 95 birds in a pen right now, probably closer to 90 I think. That's a little too many for these pens. Ideally it would be 75. When they get this large, then we have to move the pens a little more often. Plus we have to come out and water and feed a little more often. So if I'm by myself, it'll take me 20 minutes to a half hour to move pens, depending on if there's any maintenance involved or you need to move a water line or something like that. I use JD as a helper. She lets me know if chickens get caught here. She perks up her ears and I kind of pay attention to her. Sometimes a chicken, if it's not paying attention or laying down, the pen will come up to it, and before it realizes it needs to get up, and it may get a foot or something snagged under the pen, and we just need to release it. Escapee. These birds are going on 8 weeks old, and then we process them at that time. They grow incredibly fast. They're a Cornish rock cross. They're designed as a meat bird. They're not really a laying bird. There's not a real multi-purpose bird that does very well with both a good layer and a meat bird. Usually you go one way or the other. So these are meat birds. They will keep growing. Right now, these are going to dress out as probably a 4.5 pound carcass. And that's almost ideal. We have some people that like 7 and 6 pound birds. We have people that like the 3.5 pound. We are raising what's called a straight run. So in other words, that's males and females. The females will not grow quite as fast, as quickly as the males. So we have a variety of sizes that way. When I first started out, we raised all cockerels because they would be uniform, and I thought that's what I needed. And that's fine if we were going through a lot of birds. You know, each in the next batch we would process with a shorter time before processing. So what else was I going to say? People have asked me about these pens. Well, how come you don't let them just free range? Well, if anyone has raised animals in this area of the country, they know that there's predators all over the place, and everything likes chickens. So when we first started this out, we had a great problem with coons. People would ask about coyotes. Well, not really. This was too much of a preventative measure for coyotes to mess around with. Coons would be a different story. They would dig around underneath and grab and pull out whatever they could, and they were atrocious. Sometimes you'd get a coon that you just couldn't stop it. Eventually, we would get the culprit and then dispatch the culprit. You can't just relocate them. They're going to come back. Once they find an easy meal like this, they're going to be back. So we would use live traps mainly, and then dispose of them after that. The other thing is, we want to control where the nutrients are going. So if they're free range, they're going to be spreading their droppings out so far that we will not see much of an impact anywhere. So that's another reason for the pens and why I like this. Even Joel Salatin has experimented with other types of arrangements. The netting with free range within a netting and moving that netting, that's as much work or more than this. And you also have a problem with aerial predators. So not only do we have land-based animals, we have hawks, we have owls, eagles, all these things like chicken. So I'd like to also show you the progression of how the grass and the legumes are coming back after the pens have been moved. So here's what it looks like after we just moved today. So it's a little damp and wet looking under there because we've had rains recently. We had an inch of rain a couple days ago. So the ground is still drying out. There's not much left simply because we recently mowed. Like I said, a week, 10 days ago is when we cut this for hay. Before that, it was very long, and as we get back here a little further, I'll kind of show you what that looked like moving the pens across. So this is the kind of regrowth we're getting after 3 weeks, and we even clipped this a little bit when we cut with the hay. So you can see this comes back very quickly. Chicken manure has a lot of nitrogen in it. Grass loves nitrogen, so it's just a marriage made in heaven with plant nutrients as far as that's concerned. These fields up here also get a lot of hog manure, which is high in phosphorus. If anything, up here we're short on potassium of major nutrients. Almost everywhere, university around the farm, we're short on boron, sulfur, some of the other micronutrients. That's where we really need to bring in an amendment to help bring those back up. I want to show you how this all starts out. We buy chicks from the hatchery. I explained about the straight run and sexed chicks. These are straight run birds. Since when they're very small, they have no feathers. Now, these birds are 11 days old, going on 12. They're starting to feather out. This is going to give them warmth and protection so they won't get chilled. They're very sensitive to heat and cold changes. They like a 95-degree temperature early on, so we keep them in a brooder house that has brooders, which are heat source, and in our case we're using heat lamps. When they come, they're half that size, and they're just little yellow balls of fluff. They look like a yellow cotton ball. In a week, they've already grown twice the size. A week to 12 days, I guess, is what we're talking about right now. In 2.5 to 3 weeks, depending on the weather, depending on how feathered out they are, we'll move them outside to those pens. But we really have to base it on the weather. We don't want to move them out into a rainstorm. They'll pile up and smother themselves, trying to retain body heat, and just because it's something new. Even in here, we do things as a step. Right now with the brooder on, there's light on all the time. So it's warm, it's familiar to them, they can see what they're doing, they can eat, drink, sleep whenever they want. And they can move out, away from the brooder if it's too warm in there, under the brooder if it's a little chilly. Wind and breeze are the main factor that works against them. So we control that a little bit by the door and the windows. If it's really breezy, we're going to pull that shut more. Breezes will make them pile up too and smother. Also, if it's too hot, for whatever reason, they'll pile up and smother. They're trying to get further and further away, and they can only get so far because of the walls, and they pile up. So it's constant monitoring the smaller they are. We're using wood chips as a bedding source. I put that in twice a day. We have quite a few numbers in here. We've got 800 little birds in here. And by 2 weeks, there's no extra room, so we have to get them out anyway. But early on, they like to be together, and they will flock together, so to speak. So the size of this building works good up to a certain age. So we are in a field where the chicken pens were actually 2 years ago. This is a second year seeding. Last year was first seeding. Actually, they haven't been out here for 3 years because we had a year of corn here, and then we seeded alfalfa, brome grass, orchard grass mix with a oats cover crop. We were able to take everything off as a forage mix, including the oats. Off this 10-acre patch, we had taken, I think it was almost 40 1,200-pound bales. So you can do the math, figure out the tonnage per acre, but it was very, very good. And then we were also able to take a crop of forage after that too. So we did very well on this. I'm not going to attribute that all to the chickens, but I think a large part of it had to do with that this shallow to rock clayey soil did so well. So I want to point something out. So this is a second year on a new seeding. We have alfalfa. We have all this clover, which was volunteer. We did not plant this. So that was a seed bank in the soil over the years. So we planted no clover unless the seed company gave us a bag of clover instead of alfalfa and charged us the alfalfa price. This is orchard grass. It's starting to come through. The alfalfa and clover are so thick in here that they're not allowing much more of the grass to come in. I do seed heavy with the alfalfa. We go 18 pounds to the acre. We're using a drill. We're not broadcasting. It's not a no-till drill. It's just a regular drill. So I go a little heavy on the seed because I figure that's a cheaper expense than coming in again with more seed a second time. Once again, the clover is just an added benefit. The orchard grass, we're going 4 pounds per acre, and the brome grass 2. So I've been doing other seedings this last year, and I'm trying to add a few more species, but we're not using a lot of different types of species. We're using a couple different varieties of the same species. We're using 2 types of orchard grass, 2 types of brome. My finding is, particularly as you see here now, if we were to sow timothy or some of the grasses that take a little longer to establish, they would just disappear. We'd never ever see them. Once again, we've had a great spring. We're going to be cutting this tomorrow. You can see the clover's in full bloom. The alfalfa in places is in bloom. And we don't do any spraying. If we want to control weeds here, we come out and we cut. I see there's a thistle coming in here. We of course don't want those to go to seed. and there's a few other amaranth and other weeds in here that we want to control with cutting. So we're anticipating 3 cuts off of here. We're not real intensive, we're not dairy, we are beef. We like the beef quality. We like to get a 50-50 mix of alfalfa or some legume and grass. That's ideal for the growing livestock and overwintering the cows. First crop will go to cows as their winter hay. The second cuttings and third cuttings will go to the yearlings and the younger stock that we're raising. So I have not done a soil test out here for many years. I've got to go back and find that. As soon as this is cut, we're going to do a soil test here. This area is, as I mentioned, where the chicken pens were 4 years ago, and we would go down the field. We never get to the far end of the field. We're not raising enough batches to get that far, and oftentimes we get down maybe with 2 groups. We'll come back and start on the next half to kind of cover this whole upper half. So our thinking with the Jo Daviess Soil and Water Coalition group is, what's the soil test up here where the chickens have been? And then what's it going to be down there where they've not been? Is there a difference? And unfortunately, I don't have historical comparisons. I will go back and check. I don't know that I've got a soil test previously from this field. But we're going to get started on that, and we're going to do the soil health type tests. So we're not only getting nutrients, we're getting a feel for the health of the soil. I have tests from other areas in the farm. We can kind of say, well, this field is quite a bit different than this one here. But that may not be relevant simply because the fields are so different, soil types are different, and all that. All right, so we're down in the corner of the field where I think the soil type is similar to way up where the chickens were kept. This chickens didn't get down this far, but once again, the soil is deeper down here. It's not the shallow to rock soil. You can see a little difference down here, even though the field was all seeded the same and with the same equipment and the same day and everything. We're getting more orchard grass coming through. Also, even though the clover is very prevalent, I see more alfalfa down here also. So for whatever reason, maybe it's because this ground down here worked up better because of its type. We got a better seed to soil contact. I'm not sure. But I noticed this for sure. Of any area in the field, this is where we're getting more of the orchard grass coming through. So I'm going to take over here and explain a little bit of the soil test which came back, and they came back just recently. So I've not had a whole lot of chance to do a lot of comparisons except at the last minute here. So I'm going to explain the tests as best I can. There are people in this group that have dealt with these a lot more, and I certainly appreciate anyone speaking up and saying, you know, you're incorrect about that. That's fine. I pretty much know what's going on here, but I've not been dealing with soil tests every day for quite some time. So, Jay, you want to go on to the first slide? All right. So I had several other samples that I sent to the lab that day. The ones that we're going to be concerned with that were from the field that we last shown are 4N and 4SW. You'll see them highlighted. 4N is northern end of that field. The SW is the southern end of that field. So 4N is where the chickens were. 4SW is where the chickens were not. So a couple things that I'm just kind of surprised about. I was happy with the organic matter. This is something we're always trying to improve, but the organic matter in the fields that we're doing more tillage on is a lot lower. I shouldn't say a lot lower. It is lower than that. As you'll notice, as we go across, you have readings for phosphorus. You see that phosphorus levels are very high. Once again, this is because of the hog manure. That field is close to the buildings and where we have the farrowing, so it gets a lot of manure. Potassium levels, as we move on to the right, are very low. So without an amendment, which we need to do, we certainly realize that with this test,
we're probably limiting ourselves in production here on corn and or whatever we're growing out there without adding some potassium. Magnesium. In our area, Jo Daviess County, we have a dolomite limestone, which has a large magnesium component to it. If people are liming with lime from local quarries, they're going to get almost as much magnesium as they are calcium. So you can see the calcium is at medium levels. Sodium, which is not something we're real concerned about, is, well, there's a figure there. So the pH, as we keep moving further to the right, is of course the graph of acidity in the soil. Ideally for alfalfa production, we want pH somewhere between 6.8 and 7, right there where it is, I think, 6.5 to 7. I'm surprised that lower end is high. We've not done any liming out here, so this is kind of what the soil is doing naturally. As we go further to the right and then to the lines to the lower, we get a base saturation computation, which I'm not going to touch because I can't explain that well. But down towards the bottom on the right, we have micronutrient levels, which include sulfur, zinc, manganese, iron, copper, boron. We are very low in sulfur. Alfalfa likes sulfur, so our amended plan would be potassium, sulfur, manganese probably, that's low if we can get some of that in there, and boron. These are hard to, since you need such minute quantities to spread over an acre, they need to be mixed with something, so we're thinking that a combination with those and the potassium will do well. If we would go on to the next slide. This, when I put in the, when I sent the soil samples in, they can give recommendations on what you need to apply as far as nutrients to achieve a certain yield of a crop. So you plug in your crop, you plug in your estimated yield. I'm using an alfalfa grass hay at 4 tons per acre. That's conservative. We can go less or higher, but if we can get 4 tons an acre on this hill ground, I'm certainly happy with that. Anything over that is a bonus. I mentioned earlier the 150 bushel corn. I think that's achievable on these hill grounds. So as you go on, then you see the recommendations. They're telling how much nitrogen you need for the 4 bushel or 4 ton per acre, and how much you need for 150 bushel corn. Get all the way across the potassium and the phosphate and the other nutrients there. So if we compare these two, the northern end of the field where the chickens were and the lower end of the field, can we go back, Jay, to the previous slide? I'm still a little uncertain how all this applies to the chickens either being there or not being there. I see that our phosphorus level is higher where the chickens were. I got to thinking about that recently. It could be because we are feeding the chickens grain. There is high phosphorus in the mineral mix. The mineral that we use in most livestock minerals is high in phosphorus. Phosphorus and calcium are the main nutrients in a mineral mix, and then you have all the micronutrients. So the fact that chickens are depositing what they've eaten directly on the ground could be the result of the phosphorus being so high where they were, as opposed to being more in a moderate or medium level where they were not. Other than that, I don't know that I can point out any other things that jump out at me at this time. Everything else is kind of similar. You know, once again, we're low in both patches for sulfur, boron, and potassium. So, Jay, now can we advance 2 slides? This is a soil health analysis of the sample where the chickens were, the northern end of the field. Now, I'm just becoming familiar with these, so I can't explain a whole lot. I'm thinking maybe the slide is sharp enough that people can read what some of these things are. So in other words, that green bar at the top right of the chart 38 soil health calculation, and it kind of runs off the page, off the chart, so to speak. If you look down towards the bottom of the sheet, it says the soil health calculation uses the CO2 burst, organic carbon, organic nitrogen, and the CN ratio to generate the soil health number. So anyway, the higher the number, the better your soil health is. The CO2 burst, it says it's an indicator of the microbes being active in the soil. So that's really what soil health is all about, is getting microbes to break down nutrients in the soil so that the plants can use them, and also interacting with the plant roots in a very thumbnail description here. So you can see these bars on the left hand of the screen. Just kind of get a feel for where they are. A lot of them are up in the very high level. The CO2 burst, 1 day CO2 burst is rather high. So Jay, if we go to the next slide, this is where the chickens were not. We see some of these things, the H3A extraction is not as great. We don't have as many of these levels in the very high reach. Our soil health calculation is still very high, 31.1, and off the chart, so to speak, again. Our 1 day CO2 burst is very high. These, I think, are all good indicators, but I have nothing to compare them to, except we did a sampling in a bottom field, a river bottom field that gets corn on corn and a lot of tillage. Our soil health calculation, that green bar up there near the top right, it was red, and the figure was 7.0. So off the top of my head, I'm thinking, because we have such a minimal soil disturbance on these hill fields, that our soil health, in other words, the microbial activity, is greater on these fields that have less tillage than in the bottom where we're doing a lot of tillage. Now, one other thing here, the soil test on the bottom field that was so low in soil health calculation was done late in the fall. It was almost, ground was almost getting ready to freeze. So I don't think we're comparing apples to apples there. Not to say that if we had taken a sample down there in the spring, as similar time as to when this was taken, that calculation may have been different. I'm not sure. The bottom fields we have just put into basically a hay field. We're using a same mix that we use on the field that we got these had these chickens on. So we're doing oats cover crop and alfalfa seeded, and 2 types of brome, 2 types of orchard grass. So in a couple of years, I'm hoping to see some definite differences in the soil health down there.